Hello, everybody. I just wanted to provide an overview of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in our readings for this week. But what is Marxism? And I also wanted to just remind you that I've also placed a couple other videos up on that will be helpful in understanding, namely political theorist Jody Dean's talk on communism or feudalism, which really links some of these ideas to the present. And here's a quote from another contemporary philosopher, Bertrand Oman, says, who basically captures what Marxism is. It's an analysis of the complex and developing relations between these two classes. And these two classes, as we've discussed at length, are really coming to the fore in our present society during this crisis that we exist in. So it's very useful to think through a lot of these concepts and understand our present. But Marx, and if you've watched the young Karl Marx movie now, I think it's helpful in pivoting from the influence of GWF Hegel and how it really influenced the thinking on the dialectic. And remember, the dialectic is something that what we began with thinking through with Socrates. Um, and you might have seen some of these concepts before of the thesis, antithesis, leading to a synthesis. So in Hegel, what we have, and we were in class, I've done this on the board before, where I brought the whole of history is the opposition of ideals. So from Hegel, we get the idea of the unity of opposites. How do we progress and move forward through history and elevating the consciousness? And if you recall, I did A, B leading to C, the clashing of A and B leading to C. Or think of it in this way, as you have here, it's what is the thesis? It's that true statement. And what is its opposition, the antithesis? And them coming together leads to a synthesis, a higher order of understanding. But rarely, as it says here, is it a compromise between the two ideas. It is whichever idea has more force, more truth behind it will lead to. And that is a kind of a crude grounding for how Marx would apply Hegel's thinking to the material world, right? Or the world as it is constructed and shaped by these oppositions. And one thing what we're engaging in these thinkers now is the idea of critical philosophy or critical theory, right? And it's critical in the realm that we must critique in order to understand, but also critique as a form to build something better. And this is Marx in a letter to Arnold Bruges in 1844, where he outlined that vision of critical philosophy. And he says that the role of the thinker is to engage in the ruthless criticism of the existing order. Ruthless in that it will shrink neither from its own discoveries nor from the conflict with the powers that be. And this is something that we're confronting in society. If we are critical in this sense, and we truly want to understand, not only understand, but change the world, we have to be fearless, right? And this is the lesson that we get from this letter and from engaging in this type of critical theory. So we won't get into, this is something that I had laid out for us in class from capital, but on primitive accumulation, but we'll come back hopefully, and I'll get back to that. But for Marx, and this is from his famous 11 Theses on Feuerbach, taking from that idea of engaging in critical theory, but not simply in an armchair world, right? But it's doing something about it. And his statement of philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but realizing the need to change it. As many sit back now and think about and endure the crisis that we're in, is how are we going to change the structure of society? We know that the existing order cannot sustain the existing arrangement is not beneficial to people at the lower rungs of society. So how do we change that, right? So for dialectical philosophy, nothing is set in stone, right? As we read in the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. So what does that mean? Mean that the world do not one way to think about it is the world as it is can be changed and altered once consciousness is elevated and workers um, really rise up and challenge the powerful. And we see that happening across the country right now. Workers, from fast food workers, um, grocery strike workers, Amazon, Trader Joe's, all these workers who are on the front lines being themselves put at risk and not being paid uh, or even given protections are challenging that arrangement, right? So that's one uh, example that we can see. So for Marx, what he takes from Hegel here, he takes that Hegelian dialectic, the thesis, the antithesis, coming together, leading to a higher form of consciousness. But for Hegel, one key determinant is this existed in the realm of the idea. For Karl Marx, he um, famous assertion that Marx turns Hegel upon his head, brings him down to earth to the material conditions. So Marx is a materialist, not a materialist in trying to acquire iPhones and those things that make us feel good, a Gucci handbag and whatever those things are. Not that sense. Materialism, that's not we're thinking of philosophical materialism as in engaged in the material world, matter as it is formed. And that's how our consciousness is shaped. Um, so for he inverts Hegel, and this is how that dialectical opposition begins to take form, hence the notion of historical materialism. History is made by the historical context that exists and the opposition of forces that collide in that moment. Okay, and mainly these are two other Marxist concepts: the base and the superstructure. And the base meaning the idea of the political economy. The base is, in general, the means of production, right? It is, so think of, in our sense, capitalism shapes everything else, or the superstructure, right? It's the education, the family, and a political science concept that you can think of here is political socialization. How are we socialized in all these spheres? How do we gain our our ideas about the world? Well, they all emanate, according to Marx, from the base, from capitalism and its needs. So the ideas that we are all shaped by are actually not our ideas. They are come from the elite, the capitalist, the bourgeoisie class, right? And by them producing those ideas through the economic system, we sustain that level of hierarchy for them, right? And it's through media, family, religion, and everywhere else. And here is a link you can copy and watch this concept on alienation as we're thinking through estranged labor. How does one become alienated from yourself? So this will be useful in as you read through and make sense of this as you're thinking for the exam. And another link here that you can watch. And in the manifesto, as I was mentioning this, the dialectical process, and it's not just of thought, right, but is engaged in the material reality which that thought reflects. And these are the pages here that we're looking at. But in the second passage where material reality embodies the whole universe of so-called physical and mental processes, the object of calling it material is to emphasize that it is that to which thought must correspond if it is to be valid. How does one make sense of that truth if it is real, right? So it is both the physical and the mental engaged in the material, if that makes sense, right? I mean, and that's the way to make sense of it, not if that makes sense. But if that's a way to make sense of it, as alluding to some of the examples I gave to you on the workers and engaged in thought and action, how does one make history? You engage in the world, right? And so I want to come back to Locke on the labor theory of value, right? Because for Locke, briefly, the idea that value can be created by accumulation on currency, if we recall that for a property in that section 5 on the Second Treatise of Civil Government. But for Marx, this is what's produced is surplus value over and above the work of others, right? So this would be exploitation, right? We hear the word exploitation. How is one exploited? Well, all workers, according to Marx, are exploited, relatively speaking. If you don't own the means of production, all we have to sell is our labor, whether it's mental labor, physical labor, any labor you are doing, there is profit. There's a profit margin off of everything you give into that product, making a commodity, providing a service, giving a lecture, anything that we do, there is a profit value there, right? So, um, and I'll come back to this, and we're going to get into it in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. But this from, as we're reading A Strange Labor, what Marx makes clear here is that the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. Remember, that's what we think of as profit. The more his production or surplus value, the more his production increases in power and size, the worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity, the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion the devaluation of the world of men. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity, and this in the same general proportion in which it produces commodities. Right? So through labor, beyond labor as being useful, meaning the distinction to other Marxist concepts that we think about, that we get from, and not very simply put, use value, those things that we value simply or we need just for their own use, and then how that transforms itself into an exchange value. How much do you pay for things, right? That's a simple way to just think about those two things right now. Use value versus exchange value. Two different things, but emanating from the same uh, element of labor that one puts into, but taking on some new form once it is exchanged on the market. So this concept of alienation is central to how one, through the act of labor and the profit that's being acquired from one's labor by the bourgeoisie, in turn, alienates the worker. It does something to the human being, right? So one approach, the approach that we're taking to understanding Marx and that we've taken throughout the course, is the human being that I keep centering for us. How is one capable of becoming more human through these ideas that we're engaging with all these thinkers? Or how is one being dehumanized through these ideas that we're thinking about and how they're being applied? So for Marx, this is a very dehumanizing, this is my own language, dehumanizing process for the worker, right? Because it becomes, they are no longer tied to their species being, their human essence, my words, and we become something else. We live in order to work, right? That is our life. The time off is very small. We value it. But our main goal is we are first primarily a worker to produce profit for others. And if you're tied to that idea, you watch the video on neoliberalism, which probably gives you some insight into what we're discussing here. So as you're reading these texts and thinking about the political economy, again, thinking about the political economy today with a very open mind and examining how things are and thinking about how they maybe ought to be, this is where these these readings, right, as we're going through them right now, help us make sense of the world, right? And that's the takeaway that I want us to have as we move through from Marx now onto Mills and onto the other thinkers as we close out. So I hope this was just a helpful overview, very general overview in the time, and I don't want to keep you through an entire lecture but I want to give you the time to go